This portion of the Texas or South Central sector of the hypothetical Sino-Russian invasion, this portion is in regards to the portion of the battle space right above the advance of Group Armies 7 through 13, whereby the People's Armed Police had its forces itself not part of the PLA's chain of command, but rather separate chain of command, answering only to the party and to Supreme Leader Xi Jinping. The PAP, or People's Armed Police, was a fanatical paramilitary element, very heavily armed, like some other paramilitary elements around the world that were very similar to it, like the Iranian Pasdaran, or IRGC, which itself had its own air branch, missile branch, even naval branch and space command branch. The PAP was almost in some ways itself like the Waffen-SS, like in the days of old during World War II fame. The PAP had plenty of combat experience, having obtained it in the westernmost regions of China, having had fought a very low-level counter-insurgency campaign for a number of years as tensions at times boiled over, and there were restive minority groups within China that half wanted to obtain their freedom from the CCP, while the other half was more conformist. But the half that wanted freedom tried to fight back, but were brutally crushed by the PAP, who itself is specially trained in counterinsurgency warfare. But in addition to such, it is absolutely fully armed and equipped to take on actual military units in the field and be able to defeat them. Similar to the relationship held by the U.S. Army vis-a-vis the U.S. Marine Corps, and similar to the way that the active PLA would give its hand-me-downs to its humongous ready reserve forces, well, likewise, the PAP was one of a handful of different Chinese paramilitary branches that got hand-me-downs as well. And as such, they were actually quite well endowed with very potent, very modernized, albeit slightly older equipment. However, even so, it was still plenty effective enough to get the job done. And first-line PAP units of the active PAP, as the PAP at its full strength numbered some 3.2 million when activating its actual reserve elements, as the active PAP was approximately 1.5 million, although itself having another 1.7 million names on the rolls that it could call upon to mobilize in a time of emergency or need, such as the invasion of America. The PAP's different contingents, as they're called, such as the 1st and 2nd Mobile Contingents, for example, had well in excess of 500,000 personnel apiece. And just as the PLA obtained vital combat experience itself from the most recent being the Syrian Civil War, where the PLA actually sent special operations forces on multiple tours, one example being the Night Tigers, as was widely reported. The PAP as well, with its treasure trove of combat experience from within its own nation in the hinterlands in Xinjiang, was ready to put their skills to the test. As in this enormous invasion, they too would play a role in the Group Army 7 through 13 invasion prong, as the PAP's 4th Corps had 3 of its subunits in just this area, one being a Trojan unit, the 7th PAP Brigade, or regular mechanized infantry brigade, the 5th PAP Medium Brigade, which had mechanized infantry and light tanks, and the PAP 4th Artillery Regiment, which in its totality, although it operated lighter towed howitzers such as the Type 83 122 millimeter howitzer, not to be confused with the other Type 83 artillery piece, the Type 83 self-propelled 152 millimeter howitzer, the Type 83 towed howitzer was a completely different piece, and it was a much smaller caliber of a gun, but it could get the job done, as well as the battalion of 130 millimeter Type 59-I or -1 as a Roman numeral artillery piece, which was a bit larger in caliber, but was very destructive when fired in large volleys. As in grand total, the 4th PAP Artillery Regiment itself, between all 3 of its firing battalions, 2 being the Type 83 battalions of the towed 122 millimeter pieces, and 1 being of the larger Type 59-I or -1 pieces, had a grand total of 172 artillery howitzers between all 3 of these battalions combined. As the 4th PAP Artillery Regiment itself consisted of the 3 firing battalions, each battalion comprised of a headquarters company along with 7 firing batteries each, as the PAP was not the PLA and was thus comprised a bit differently when it came to its combat forces. The 4th PAP Artillery Regiment did have a headquarters and a separate support company, specifically to aid in logistical operations as it pertained to the 3 different firing battalions, as each firing battalion had its own headquarters company as well, which likewise added to the logistical capabilities of the force. This is the Battle of Ranchas, Penitas West, and Delores. Take you now to the map itself. Another force operating in the area, as there was enormous air cover throughout the entire invasion, was not quite a brand new cutting-edge 4.5 generation aircraft like in the previous battle at Loredo, going on literally at the same time just to the south, but the older Nanchang Q-5 flown by reservists, as the aircraft were maintained in storage for reserve pilots of the PLAAF to be able to add to the overall ground attack and close air support capabilities of the PLAAF in a time of war. And thus, as all reserves of the regular PLA military, its ground forces, PLAAF, its PLAN, and its strategic missile forces were all mobilized with full reserve mobilization in addition to their active forces, along with the paramilitary forces of China being mobilized for this invasion, this enormous invasion. They brought every piece of equipment belonging to these different reserve type elements out of storage and put them into the fray, into the battle. The Q-5 squadron operating in this battle space, this being another 50 by 50 mile battle space, just as the battle going on to the south, the Loredo battle, as previously shown, which is literally going on at the same time as this battle and is the same time as the McAllen and Lower Rio Grande battle and every other battle in this campaign. This is where the 4th PAP Corps' 3 different subunits mentioned earlier were taking place in the fighting. At midnight, when the anti-satellite weapon strike occurred, along with the tandem cyber attack, the various forces all along the border began to cross in their different invasion prongs all over the country, but as well in this sector, as going north into New Mexico, up I-25, as that being a major invasion route. Forces headed to Amarillo in the Panhandle before splitting up and going to aid the various forces in New Mexico, Oklahoma, and even Kansas as one part of these now separate group armies headed further north to western Kansas, along with group armies 7 through 13 being perhaps the most important invasion prong in this sector of all, going up I-35 straight into Kansas to link up with Trojans that are already up there doing the main fighting and capturing objectives, along with the prong coming down south from Canada, which likewise was to link up in Kansas. And all these group armies, as they moved, would occasionally shed 1 or 2 group armies depending upon where they were going, such as this prong that broke through the south and headed into the American Southeast, shedding a group army in Houston to relieve an active duty PLA group army, the 83rd PLA Group Army, to head north into the Texarkana, Texas area, where it would split up and occupy and set up its own AO up there, while a group army would be shed from Group Armies 15 through 20, Group Army 15 being the one that was to relieve the 83rd Group Army on its march, on this prong's march into the southeast, while yet another group army, the 20th, would be shed off in the New Orleans area, while the rest would continue into Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, splitting into their own areas respectively. But as for the PAP units involved, their entire purpose within this part of the campaign was to essentially smash all resistance on the northern flank of the 7 through 13's advance inland, as well as to pacify the region between the border and San Antonio, right behind the advance of Group Army 7 through 13. And pacification operations in and of themselves would be savage and brutal and nasty beyond words, beyond all comprehension. Back to the map. As Group Army 10, leading Group Army 7 through 13, was literally in the AO just to the south of this battle space, conducting their part of the invasion, their electronic warfare systems from the 10th Signals Brigade, further south, part of the PLA 10th Group Army, was affecting radios and communications, redundant systems within this battle space as well, as the jamming systems of the 10th Signals had an extremely long range, well over 50 miles, approximately 100, so it covered this whole area within its radius. They're facing the PAP forces were a hodgepodge of reactionary armed Americans with intelligence reports received by the Chi-Coms informing them that most of the armed Americans in this area, especially within the Delores medium-sized town, which actually had an industrial park within it and a commerce center, many of the civilians in this area, approximately 1,000 just in Delores alone, were somewhat well armed due to the previous past failed border policies, as the flood of people across the border in previous years had not just demoralized the people of the area, but forced them to adapt and overcome, and thus arm themselves as well as possible, and even learn how to become familiar with their personal equipment, as it was called, and go and train with it. Also in the area were an increased presence of border paramilitary forces as well as customs enforcement forces, essentially American paramilitary outfits, agencies were operating in this area, guarding key border crossings, as well as having motor pools and administrative facilities and other type facilities within the area. The Nanchang Q-5s would be conducting all the close air support and ground strike operations within this particular AO. The Q-5 itself was a very capable aircraft despite its age, and had gone through a dozen series of upgrades to the point to where it has become much more advanced than the older, already quite well upgraded Q-5D variant, and now has been upgraded to the Q-5G, which is the most recent of upgrades. This has better range than the older Q-5D, which was a very shorter range combat aircraft and could not stay in the air for a particularly long time without extra fuel tanks or aerial refueling. Much like the Russian Su-25. The Su-25 still being a superb ground attack aircraft or close air support aircraft as well, much like the Q-5 was also suffering from a range issue. But the newest version of the Q-5, the Q-5G, has enhanced range of 1,200 miles. Although it can only carry roughly a quarter of the payload of the much more advanced, much more modern and capable JH-7s, which equipped the Active Duty PLAAF forces, and also the PLAN had these aircraft, which were superb, excellent strike aircraft. It could only carry a quarter of the ordnance that the JH-7 could carry, and was a bit slower than the JH-7, but had approximately the same exact combat range as the JH-7, now that the Q-5G was further upgraded from the Q-5D. The Q-5G carried a laser designator pod, which meant that it could drop laser-guided precision munitions. It had 10 different hardpoints, which meant it could carry 10 different types of ordnance. Typically, on these sorties being carried out by these Q-5s from their bases in Mexico, they would be loaded with 4 1,000-pound laser-guided heavy ordnance apiece, along with 6 130mm unguided rockets, which were large air-to-ground weapons, which all in all would equal the approximately 4,500 pounds of ordnance that each aircraft could carry. They would fly multiple sorties in order to return and reload with more ground attack munitions in order to keep up constant pressure on enemy ground forces, and also to strike specific targets already chosen for them as per the original battle plan, partly helped along as far as it being created with the newest and most advanced AI that China had, that it was put to military use. This aided in targeting, tracking targets in the fluid battlefield, and making much faster decisions than ever before seen in war in general. Also, the Q-5G had two 23mm autocannons in addition to its 10 hardpoints, which meant that it could strafe ground targets with these autocannons, which were still, even though they were only 23mm, were still quite destructive insofar as the firepower they could deliver on a ground target. The new HUD system for the pilot and digital display and newer Type 205 Doppler Radar made this aircraft much more lethal than it had ever been before, and far more capable, along with the ability to drop precision munitions. Being that it was an older, albeit highly upgraded aircraft, the reserve pilots that flew it were very capable pilots and were very familiar with the aircraft and knew what its capabilities were and also its limitations, and made the best of all of it. In the AO to the south, a vastly more advanced aircraft was flying air superiority operations for the region, the squadron of J-16s that were operating in the Loredo area at this time of this battle as well. But China had sent so many air wings to this invasion that enormous numbers of its active air force, in addition to its reserves, were operating a myriad of different aircraft all over this embattled land. The same was true of the Russians as well, and some of the larger, smaller allies that contributed fairly decent-sized forces to the invasion as a whole, as part of the Foreign Expeditionary Army, a 500,000 strong force of all the smaller nations and their contingents combined. Initially, as midnight struck and the satellites went down and the cyber attack occurred within this sector, Q-5s immediately violated American airspace and began to hit key targets within this AO. In addition to such, the 4th Artillery Regiment of the PAP was firing enormous barrages with its 172 different howitzers belonging to its 3 battalions, each having 7 firing batteries of 8 howitzers apiece, of both the 122mm Type 83s and also the Type 59-I or -1 130mm howitzers. Artillery struck Ranchas, Penitas exceedingly hard as paramilitary forces fleeing from the south as the 10th Group Army's units were crossing the border and headed into Ranchas, Penitas west for cover were now being bombarded by the PAP and its artillery forces. Likewise was a grouping of ranchers and farmers who were all armed emerging from their properties as a nearby border patrol post was being heavily bombarded by this very same artillery. In the town of Delores, more artillery barrages were being fired, mostly at the border crossing, as light tank battalions, mechanized infantry battalions, and a support battalion all crossed the border in 3 different prongs. 2 spearheading a prong south through countryside to clear the area, along with 2 headed straight for the border paramilitary and customs paramilitary installations and armed civilians now emerging with their weaponry due to the artillery barrage and wanting to not only understand exactly what was going on, but to be able to possibly defend themselves if should it come to that. In Delores, the border post was being overran by the light tank battalion racing across the crossing, while another crossed an undefended border bridge, while yet another mechanized infantry battalion of the 5th Medium PAP Brigade headed straight north to cross the Route 1 bridge, the Mexican Route 1 bridge, which Mexican Route 1 passed the Mexican town of Colombia and encountered an American and Mexican border patrol post, although the Mexicans were told to abandon their posts minutes before the invasion in order to save their lives, because there would be exchanges of fire, undoubtedly. So the local Mexican border guards ran back to their homes where they lived in Colombia to escape from the ensuing erupting combat. As the mechanized infantry battalion moved north to seize the bridge, which was an important bridge as it could carry heavy vehicles and lots of weight, which would be important later for logistics into the area. The WZ-551 APC and IFV variants operated by the mechanized infantry forces as the light tank battalions and had their armored infantry, which consisted of their Type 62G light tanks, which were extremely upgraded light tanks, although they were passed down by the regular PLA in favor of much more advanced, brand new Type 15 light tanks for their lighter units, although some were still in the service of the reserve units and also passed to the PAP. They also possessed Type 86 infantry fighting vehicles and Type 63 armor personnel carriers, along with the Type 62G light tanks that comprised these battalions insofar as their combat vehicles were concerned. As the mechanized infantry battalion that headed north made it to the bridge, artillery was pounding Delores, pounding Ranchas, Penitas west, and pounding border paramilitary installations, along with aircraft pounding various targets that had already been pre-selected for them within this AO, as there were quite a few important targets needing to be dealt with throughout the area, not the least of which being the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment, the battalion that was part of the 72nd Infantry Brigade combat team that was actually separate from the rest of the brigade and within this AO. One of their companies was even forward deployed into the town of Delores itself due to the hostilities erupting with the Sino-Russian naval drills before the invasion, and the fact that the nation was only just starting to mobilize for a crisis, calling up their Guard and Reserve forces and fortifying the border the best way they could with local National Guard elements, such as the 72nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team, for one, among other forces such as paramilitary border forces, sending more of them to fortify key crossing areas, as was the case in this bridge, the Route 1/Route 255 bridge, as Route 255 would be a very important route within this battle. As the artillery flew, being fired by the different batteries comprising the different battalions of the 4th PAP Artillery Regiment of the PAP's 4th Corps, thunderous booms were a non-stop occurrence. 8 howitzer apiece batteries fired from Mexico at their pre-prepared firing positions, set up hours before the invasion was to commence. The troops of these artillery battalions within their respective batteries, such as this battery here, this one battery out of 7 that comprise a battalion, the troops here were ordered to fill sandbags and dig foxholes for security purposes, where a soldier could be posted with a Type 67 general purpose machine gun, as well as down here as well. As even though they were firing from Mexico, which was safe as they were setting up, the PAP still didn't take any chances and were actually more proactive than many PLA units were, insofar as keeping the troops busy, keeping them occupied, and getting them ready for what was to come. The PAP dressed, trained, and essentially for all intents and purposes was equal to a military unit. Even PAP recruiting commercials in China show PAP artillery troops, infantry troops, mechanized troops, and helo-borne forces. And the PAP even has special operations forces as well. These are 122 millimeter howitzer shells with the nose plugs still on. This guy is unscrewing the nose plug to put a fuse, a point detonation fuse on it, a PD fuse. Same with this guy. For this gun section here, here's the sergeant. There's a corporal bending down to grab a powder canister. As you can see him putting his hands on the, kneeling down, putting his hands to pick up this powder canister for this howitzer. As the shell with the fuse screwed onto it was loaded, and then you grab the ram and you push it up to where you seat the round, then you put the powder in, then you shut the breech, you put the primer in, you attach the lanyard, and you pull the lanyard and pow! Out goes a shell. And then you repeat the process over and over and over as the FDC, or Fire Direction Control, this is their truck. This is a truck-mounted FDC unit right here attached to this Dongfeng EQ240 truck. You can see the antennae and for receiving radio transmissions, satellite data from combat data links, drone data, the works. And they have their computing systems in here, all their ballistic computers and everything else, to calculate fire missions as they come in, as the requests for fire come in, or orders from higher up come in to tell them where to fire. They relay it to the gun line. The gun line sets up their howitzers with their proper elevation, traverse, the whole nine. And then they utilize the right shell and fuse combination and the right amount of powder charges. Because as powder charges come in these canisters, you can literally take parts of them out, along with the elevation and traverse of the barrel. determines how far the shell goes. If you put the maximum charge in there with the right elevation and traverse, you can make the shell go to its maximum range, which for these howitzers is approximately 15 miles. Unlike some of the newer Chinese howitzers, either towed or self-propelled, like the 155 millimeter howitzers that China now makes, that has brand new types of shells created for it. Not that their 152 artillery isn't still incredible, but their 155 artillery is far more advanced now than many other types of pieces they utilize. These are lighter pieces. These are 122 millimeter. These are for lighter units or for paramilitary forces like these PAP troops. Again, the People's Armed Police is far more than a typical gendarmerie. Yes, they have arrest powers, but it's all in the name. Armed police is in militarily armed and trained, but they're a parallel military structure. They're a paramilitary force, like the Iraqi Republican Guard or the Iranian Pasdaran / IRGC as it's called, and like the Waffen-SS of the days of old in World War II. This is a very similar type of element in many ways. Yes, they do have artillery. It's even in their recruiting commercials in China. They have armored forces, of course. They use a lot of wheeled armored vehicles, but they also use light tanks too. And they're definitely a very infantry-heavy force. So they do use a lot of wheeled armor personnel carriers, but they can also do ordinary policing operations when within China itself, like domestically, or it can be used in counterinsurgency operations or full-blown military on paramilitary operations, because these men are a paramilitary force and they can go up against ordinary militaries because they do have the firepower. They also have the backing of the PLA if worse comes to worse, but these guys are fanatical. These guys are well-equipped, well-armed, well-motivated, and they're more willing to rush into danger than even the PLA because these guys are that fanatical. These are like the Praetorian Guard of the CCP. These are like some of the most elite in terms of their fanaticism. But they're also well equipped, even with the highly upgraded hand-me-downs that they receive. They had a lot of fire missions coming in, firing shell after shell after shell, old gun line erupting. This is just one battery. There's 7 batteries in a battalion, and firing batteries, that is, not counting the headquarters and support battery, but there's 7 batteries, which makes a total of 21 batteries, as there's 3 firing battalions, and then the independent support company and independent headquarters company, which comprise the whole regiment. Yep, sergeant here's having a cigarette, guard's having a cigarette. There's a few more trucks off the picture, but that's the basic idea of the artillery forces. Back to the tactical battle map of the river crossing by Colombia and Mexico, headed toward Delores. One company out of this whole larger battle, this one little segment of the larger battle at the crossing, this is the bridge itself. One company is seizing the bridge. There's 2 dismounted squads firing at the border post, which in just this one area, this 1 kilometer by 500 meter area on the American side, there are 80 American paramilitary agents within this area, because this border post had been fortified just prior to the invasion due to the increasing international tensions. And again, the Americans had literally no idea that they were going to get invaded by a full-scale invasion, and it wouldn't be some little pinprick attack. It would be a massive invasion, bigger than anything in human history, bigger than Barbarossa by 3 times. This one company alone dismounted a whole platoon, 1 squad, 1 squad, 1 squad, 1 and 1, 5 total squads. As these vehicles, these 2 different platoons, 5 apiece, of this mechanized infantry battalions, one company in this area, the leading company, one platoon, there's a vehicle off the map, one platoon, 5 vehicles, 5 and 5, 3 different combat platoons, leaving its support platoon further back where it would be safer. Mexican town of Columbia's just off the map here. Here's a Mexican home and garage separate from the home. Here's the Mexican border post parking area for the employees. They're all gone. They vacated the area. They're all gone. So these forces are rushing across the bridge now. These 2 columns, upon crossing the bridge, taking and dealing out heavy fire because they're being led. These 2 platoons are being led by their WZ-551 IFV version, which has the 25mm autocannons, whereas the APC versions only have turret gunners with 12.75mm machine guns. They're being led, each platoon, by their infantry fighting vehicle version of the WZ-551 wheeled wheeled armored fighting vehicles. So they're crossing. You have one platoon literally go straight ahead, and as they're driving, they're practically doing like a drive-by attack, firing in this way. You have one gunner oriented this way, another oriented this way, another oriented this way. They're all firing as they split up. They do a temporary pause here. As that was occurring, the dismounts, you already have these guys that were laying in wait until the invasion was set to start at midnight. They snuck into position, and they were laying in wait in the tall grass on this side of the river on the Rio. These guys were sneaking around, getting ready to cross with them. And at midnight, they began to lay down heavy small arms fire against these roving border guards here along this razor wire, concertina wire fencing right here. This is concertina wire fencing right here. Immediately, as they laid down fire, there was bounding and covering across this shallow point in the river. You had these guys firing, and this guy bounding ahead. This group, this squad bounding ahead in the middle. Then these guys bounded ahead, these 2 squads on the flanks of this middle one. And then they started firing and throwing grenades and firing tube-fired, barrel-launched 25mm grenades up these guys. Light machine gun fire, totally waste these guys. They're gone. They're out of there. They snap the fencing, the razor concertina wire fencing, and continue through, bounding and covering. This one heads slightly to the north through this mesquite and scrub brush wooded area. This guy, or this squad and this squad bound and cover ahead. Right as this platoon has stopped here and now starts to go around to encircle these guys who are trying to escape the area. Some are hiding in the mesquite and scrub brush wooded area right here. As all of this was happening, as these guys were laying suppressive fire from this side, as the vehicles were driving by and firing in here and in here. See, this is a tent where they inspect vehicles, and this is the guards building. These are 2 guard posts. This is a concrete T-wall type wall that separates the different lanes of the road, and this is like a little overhead, little arch connecting this guard tower to this T-wall right here that separates the 2 lanes of the road. You know, the ongoing lane into Mexico and the lane coming in, so people have to stop if they want to inspect their vehicles. They pull them in here. See the arrow? There's an arrow right there. They pull them in, inspect them in here, and then they let them go if they're clean. They have to do it like that because there's a guard post here and a guard post here. They stop them at this one, but if they try to blow the checkpoint, this guy can raise up the spikes. But it didn't work here because you have all this fire going on. It's peppering these buildings, these personnel trying to flee. They're getting peppered. These roving guards that are patrolling along the concertina wire fencing, they're getting peppered. There were drivers in these MRAPs who pulled out of the parking lot trying to stop what was going on as all the fire was being exchanged. These guys did fire back, but they just didn't have enough firepower to really do anything. They didn't even eliminate any Chi-Coms. They wounded a few, but they didn't take any out. But these guys were all taken out. CH-901A loitering munitions. A facet in many battles had been launched by the Headquarters Battalion. Its specialized drone sections launched a 48 drone salvo with heat warheads headed for Delores, but also some were diverted to destroy these MRAPs. 8 different MRAPs were destroyed by 8 different CH-901s. All as this was happening, as these forces were literally making it across the bridge, these guys are bounding and covering, these guys were laying suppressive fire on this side. All as that happened, these CH-901As began hitting their targets one by one, destroying the MRAPs. And there were 4 more that just flew on towards Delores, except for this one here, which eliminated these guys that somehow survived and were trying to flee the area. They were hit by one of these heat rounds, and the explosion was powerful enough that it took out the surviving people that tried to flee the area, who were also being fired at by this platoon that went this way to try and surround a larger area. And what ended up happening was this was only one company. When you go back to the area, that was the spearheading company. They went around a 3 by 3 kilometer area, or approximately 1.4, about 1.4 miles, because there were 2 other border facilities. There was a motor pool facility and an administrative facility within that same area off of a few different farm roads within just that area, because there were 300 of these paramilitary forces. And the rest of the battalion crossed the bridge because this company, the spearheading company, had already seized the bridge intact without any issues. They annihilated these 80 personnel. So there was approximately 220 left to be dealt with at these 2 other facilities. So the rest of the battalion crossed, and a few more companies surrounded and destroyed those forces, while other companies spearheaded the attack to the edge of the Delores town. Because the town was shaped like this. You had the commerce part of the town. They had a commerce center up here and some homes and businesses. And then they had homes down here. There was a downtown with some 3-story buildings and whatnot. And also their industrial park in this corner down here. It was an interesting layout for a town. It was an interesting town. It was not a huge town by any means, but it was a industrial town for all intents and purposes, and it was actually a blue-collar town, and there were a lot of working people in this town, and it was a medium-sized town of approximately 15,000 within the town and immediate surrounding area. So this town was heavily armed after years of failed border policy yet again. So as these forces crossed in strength, these vicious, brutal PAP forces who were firing enormous amounts of artillery from their own artillery forces in this sector at different targets across the border, they were pummeling Delores badly, especially in its southern portions here. And as this brigade started crossing in 3 different prongs, one going in the center, one going in Delores, and one going into the south, along with the PAP's 7th Brigade, which was further to the north, they just broke out of their CCP properties and were coming together before advancing down into this battle space to aid their fellow 4th Corps units, which the 4th Corps of the 2nd PAP Mobile Contingent was operating in this area, this whole area, with PLAAF support from Nanchang Q-5s of their reserve PLAAF forces, who were mobilized specifically for the invasion, along with all the active forces, which flew far more advanced aircraft. But these older aircraft were still highly effective for what they were being used for. At the end of this battle, by its end, Group Army 7 through 13 would be proceeding up I-35, but it was imperative for the time being that this entire battle space, just north of the Loredo battle going on concurrently, simultaneously, this whole battle space had to be completely cleared by the PAP shock forces of any armed resistance. Aiding them in reconnaissance for ISR in this one battle space is a CH-4A armed reconnaissance drone. They also have their own platoon-level quadcopter drones. Instead of squad-level like most PLA units have, the PAP at least has platoon-level quadcopter recon drones, which is still very effective for ISR because even at the platoon level, a small unit can know exactly what's going on. Although at the squad level, every single individual squad can do their own recon with a quadcopter, but even at the platoon level, it's still at a small enough level to where small units can recon an area exceedingly well. The U.S. Armed Forces, as of 2024, didn't even have squad or even platoon level reconnaissance drones in the sense of quadcopter drones. Only certain units had small drones, and they were fixed-wing drones that could only stay in the air for very short periods. Nothing like this. Nothing like what the PLA and its paramilitary PAP had available to it in the numbers they had it to, and at the smallest levels. The high-flying reconnaissance drones aided ISR efforts greatly, along with satellite assets, which China had the most military satellites in the world, still does. Russia had the third amount, but now it has the second amount because all of America's satellites have been downed by Chinese and Russian anti-satellite weapons at the time of this invasion. The next sub-battle of the Battle of Ranchas Penitas West / Delores will be within the town of Delores itself, wherein the American defenders fight savagely, just as savage as the brutal PAP itself. The Americans fight equally savagely just to survive, because the PAP, proverbially speaking, plays by a different set of rules than does the PLA regular military. The PAP is the far most brutal element of the CHICOM security forces. Although other paramilitary elements were much more humane, like the National Militia, which were everyday Chinese that were conscripted into this home defense type force and sent abroad to aid in an invasion. And they had a lot more empathy for the American population, and the PLA generally tried to stick by the Geneva Conventions during this invasion. They modified it slightly, but in general, they still followed humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions for the most part. But they bent it a lot. But the PAP was outright nasty and savage, ugly towards the local populace during this invasion. The Battle of Delores would be a hard-fought battle that would last an actual total of 3 hours before the last flickers of resistance would be put down, as these forces resisting within this mixed industrial, commerce, and residential town would be fighting a guerrilla-style campaign despite heavy losses within just the first hour from artillery, airstrikes, and savage ground combat. The armed civilians especially would break up into small groups and even carry out self-destructive Molotov attacks by charging and setting up ambushes where they would try to get the drop on PAP forces only to be seen first and annihilated while still trying to carry out their attack. There were a few successes, but for the most part, resistance was crushed, and savagely so. The Battle of Ranchas, Penitas West, and Delores will continue in the next part of the series.